welcome to this webcast lecture on the Revolution of 1830 in France. In this series on the politics of the 19th century, we've already discussed the Congress of Vienna and the effect of the Holy Alliance of reactionary powers throughout the continent as a whole, including the reign of Wellington and Castlereagh during the decades of reaction, as they were known, reaction and repression in the first 2 decades of the 19th century in England. In this webcast lecture, I want to concentrate more carefully on what happened in France. After the defeat of Napoleon, the victorious powers, the reactionary Holy Alliance of Russia, Prussia, and Austria, together with their allies, the English and some smaller countries, Holland, Denmark, and so on, had reimposed a monarchy on France. They'd re-established the Bourbon dynasty, constitutional monarchy, where the monarch has executive power, but the monarch must be answerable to Parliament. That said, the new National Assembly that was part of the Restoration Constitution in France was in no way democratic. The franchise, the vote, was highly restrictive. It was more restrictive in some ways than the British Parliament at that time, which was very, very undemocratic as well until the Reform Act of 1832 began to allow even the middle classes to vote. Supreme executive power in France was invested in the monarch, and only the monarch could propose laws. At the same time, the Roman Catholic Church, which had been disestablished during the Revolution, was reinstated as the state religion. It was given a role in education and in the universities, such as there was education at that time. Religious censorship was introduced into France, and the priests, the local priests, and the whole kind of hierarchy and bureaucracy of the Catholic Church in France was paid for by the state, and aspects of canon law, church law, received the blessing of French legal common law. The model was a reactionary, conservative, constitutional democracy in which the church would play a large role and in which the French state would take its place within the Congress of Vienna system, the Congress system as it was known, within a new Europe of reactionary, religious, undemocratic and repressive states led by the Holy Alliance, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and France playing a part in that role. Although the constitution was changed in this way after the defeat of Napoleon, many of the social changes and economic changes that had been brought in by the revolution stayed in place. So, by and large, the peasants retained control of the land that they'd seized from the breakup of the big aristocratic estates. The French aristocracy, the landed aristocracy, the French, as it were, opposite number to people like Wellington in England, had been decimated by Madame Guillotine, and so land was far more widely spread in France than in England at that time. And this was to have a marked effect on the economic development of France through the 19th and 20th century. There were large numbers of small and medium-sized peasants who owned their own farms, which that they had gained during the revolution of the 1780s, 1790s, and they were to retain that. There was no wholesale return of these lands to the aristocracy. Likewise, the Napoleonic reform of the old state, the old monarchical state, stayed in place. The new Bourbon monarchy was less grandiose than it had been before the revolution. There was no Versailles culture anymore, no building of huge palaces, no Marie Antoinette sort of scene. So it was a more economical sort of monarchy. The reform of the state bureaucracy and the judicial system that had taken place during the revolution also stayed in place, which effectively meant very, very centralized control of the whole of France by the judiciary in Paris and by departments of state in Paris. So following the Restoration in 1815, there were subsequent revolutions, including the one in 1830 I'm going to talk about. But the basic shape of France as a country of peasants, of well-to-do, relatively well-to-do small farms, a highly populated countryside, very much in contrast to either England on the one hand, which was through the 19th century to become depopulated countryside with virtually no peasants, no self-sufficient farmers, industrialized farming. France was to maintain a kind of organic, local, small farm culture right up until, well, almost up to the present day, in fact. So France was a country of farmers, a rural country, a country of peasants. But it had this one overbearing city, Paris, and Paris's power over this country of peasants was a remarkable aspect of France throughout the 19th and 20th century. You have a powerful, centralized French bureaucracy ruling over an overwhelmingly peasant country. And the difference between the culture of Paris on the one hand and the one or two industrial regions that were to develop in France and the rest of the French countryside became very, very remarkable and still is to some extent. In the context of the Revolution of 1830, which this webcast is about, and the Revolution of 1848, which we're going to come on to discuss, you see that Paris is a very radical, revolutionary sort of place, but the French countryside, in the main, very conservative. Essentially, what's happened here is in the revolution of the 1780s and 1790s, the thing we call the French Revolution, the peasants had got their farms, and that's really all they wanted. They didn't want to go any further with the revolution, and they were quite happy as far as they were concerned. Hegel's, kingdom of God on earth had arrived when they got hold of the family farm, expropriating it from the aristocrats. They had no real interest in any further radical change, no sympathy with the growing urban poor. Processes in France were underway similar to those in England, perhaps not quite so dramatic as with people gathering in to the industrial towns. But because the distress of the rural population wasn't so extreme in France, because many people could still make a living in the countryside, thus the pool of labour available in the cities to develop French industry was correspondingly small. So French economic development through the 19th century was much slower than England. For most of history, France had been streets ahead in terms of its prosperity, its technological innovation, its sheer economic power. The end of that French domination really comes with the Napoleonic War and the victory of Wellington at Waterloo. And by 1850, France has fallen well behind on almost every indicator. With those remarks, we've come to the end of part one of this series of videos about the French Revolution of 1830.
The St. Clair River, Lake St. Clair, and the Detroit River, also known as the Huron-Erie Corridor, are the international waters that connect Lake Huron to Lake Erie. Environmental changes in the corridor over time have resulted in a loss of habitat for fish and other organisms. This video is focusing on the successful St. Clair River Fish Habitat Restoration Project and the science and collaboration that made it a success.
We were so surprised that lake sturgeon found the habitat and were spawning on it even though it wasn't completely constructed. we wanted to make sure that the materials we used were suitable for fish spawning. We have been perfecting the habitat materials and determined that a certain size and shape of rock was important to maximize the space between the rocks. If there's too much space, the eggs could be washed out by the water. But if the spaces are too small, the eggs would not be adequately protected from fish and other organisms. The project team developed a plan and methods to build new spawning habitat to increase lake sturgeon, lake whitefish, walleye, and other native fish populations. We learned that water flow, water depth, and water temperature were all important in the placement of a spawning reef. Another important factor is the available nursery habitat downstream that is crucial for the survival of young fish produced on the spawning reefs. One of the most important components of these habitat restoration projects is the monitoring that we do before and after the reef is constructed. In this way, we know whether any fish were there using the area before we construct the reef, and we can document the success of our spawning habitat projects. This video shows that there were lake sturgeon eggs among the rocks and adult lake sturgeon in the area before the construction was even complete.
Human alterations in the system in the late 19th and early 20th century resulted in many changes. One of the largest was the result of widening and deepening for commercial navigation. In the Detroit River alone, a major modification in the lower river resulted in the removal of over 300 million cubic meters of limestone rock and other material from the bottom of the river. The result was a dramatic reduction of fish populations throughout the entire Huron to Erie corridor. In 2004, a collaborative group of university, government, industry, and non-governmental organizations established the Huron-Erie Corridor Initiative. The first two projects, one at Belle Isle in the Detroit River, the other at Fighting Island, also in the Detroit River, but in the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge, have significantly improved fish habitat. And we've seen fish responding to our latest project in the St. Clair Delta while it was under construction. Fish habitat restoration is a key part of US EPA's strategy to restore impaired beneficial uses in the system. These restoration efforts will provide cultural and economic benefits, bolster commercial and sport fishing, and contribute to a higher quality of life for the people living in the corridor. All of these projects are part of our long-term goal to replace some of the habitat that was removed 100 years ago to support commercial navigation. The next steps for the partnership are to choose the restoration sites based on this model and build on our past successes. This is science in action, and this is the kind of research project where we're not just performing research to learn about new things, but we're applying the results for the benefit of the larger community. Our approach in the Huron-Erie corridor is a potential model for success for other locations. We're making sure that our work builds on the science that has gone before, so we're learning and adapting as we move forward.
The Huron-Erie corridor is the epicenter of fish populations and fish habitat restoration in the central Great Lakes. The fish spawning habitat restoration successes in these connecting channels